turn on some lights here.
Hello, everybody. Thanks for being here on this kind of rainy night. Welcome to Writer Speak, featuring the incredible novelist JAMIL John Kochai. I'd like to remind everybody before we start that after the reading, there's going to be a short Q&A. So if you have any questions, please just type them into the chat, the YouTube chat. I'll be monitoring it. I'll relay the questions. Anyway, JAMIL John Kochai is the author of 99 Nights in Logar, a finalist for the PEN/Hemingway Award for debut novel and the DSC Prize for South Asian Literature. He was born in an Afghan refugee camp in Peshawar, Pakistan, but he originally hails from Logar, Afghanistan. His short stories and essays have appeared in The New Yorker, The New York Times, Los Angeles Times, Ploughshares, and the O. Henry Prize Stories of 2018. Currently, he's a Stegner Fellow at Stanford University. Please welcome JAMIL John Kochai.
Hello, thank you for having me. This is such an honor. Yeah, so I'm gonna go ahead and start off by with the reading, and then so this is about maybe a third of the way into the novel. At this point in the book, the kids, the main characters, the protagonists, have sort of gone off on this journey after this guard dog named Budabash, and they've gotten themselves lost in the village. And so this is at the point where they've been separated from one another. Our main character Marwan and his cousin Zia find themselves stuck underneath this tree, hoping that either they'll be able to find one of their cousins or that they'll return to them before they can head back home. The roads darkened, the crickets chirped. There was a smell of, from time to time, a breeze would run the roads, shaking tatters of Watuk's flag, and then a gust would blow forth from the maze, rustling the leaves of the mulberry tree, so that it almost seemed as if the flag and the tree were whispering to each other. Eventually, me and Zia decided to take up Gul's original plan and travel up the road a kilometer or two until we got to Agha's compound. But just as we rose and packed and ready to continue our journey, Dawood came stumbling out of the maze. In a jumble, and hugged him very tightly as he hollered about going home and getting his brothers and saving Gul. And we were so overjoyed just to see him and to hear him that when he stopped hollering and became heavy in our hands, we didn't even notice that our hug was all that held him up. He passed out in our arms. We tried for a long time to wake him up, and smearing tooth under his nose and splashing water in his face and rubbing his belly raw and pinching the skin at his wrist, but nothing woke him. We listened closely for his heart, the both of us, and made sure it was thumping. Without any other option, me and Zia pulled Dawood underneath Watuk's mulberry tree and stripped some bushes from the side of the road. And after wrapping ourselves up in Zia's patu, we watched the flag of Watuk's marker and smelled the ash and listened for every footstep of every killer in Logar, the psychopathic white boys, the ravenous bandits, the teas and the gunmen and the drug runners, the kidney kidnappers, the robots in the sky, the wolves from the mountains and the coyotes from the rivers, the witches and the cesspits, the jinn and the monsters in the maze. We lay on either side of Dawood. I held one hand and Zia held the other. A few moments in, and I looked up over Dawood's belly and whispered to Zia, "It's so dark." "You scared?" he asked. "It's just that back in America, it doesn't get so dark because we have lights going on all night in the streets." "But who pays for the fuel?" "I think it's taxes." "You miss it over there?" "No," I said. "Fuck America. I'd rather be here." "Wallah," he said. "Don't lie in the night, Marwan. Snakes will hear." "Well," I said, "maybe not right this moment, but in general." "So you are scared?" "Maybe a little." "Of dying?" he asked quietly. I didn't say anything. I just breathed. "If we die," Zia said, "God will be there." "If we die," I said, "will you tell him I was good?" "All right," he said, and asked me to give him my right hand, which I did. And after carefully unwrapping the gauze still clinging to my skin, he traced for me, with a single finger, his evidence of God's existence. The tale of the evidence of God's existence. On the palm of your right hand, if you look at it, God has etched into your flesh the Arabic numeral 18. And on the palm of your left hand, if you look at it, Allah has traced into your skin the Arabic numeral 81. Now, if you add these numbers together, you get 99. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has 99 names. And if you take 18 and subtract it from 81, you get 63. The Prophet, peace and blessings be upon him, died at 63. So you see, Zia explained, God has etched into the palms of your hands one reminder of his own glory and another reminder of his most beloved servant. And so, but he didn't finish his point. And instead, after concluding his demonstration, he rewrapped my hand with the tattered strips of gauze and gave it back to me. For a long time afterward, in some way or other, I knew we would be saved, either in the night or in the day or in the days to come, and that it was only a matter of when, not if. At some point, both me and Zia fell asleep, and for the first time in a long time, Zia forgot to pray.
All right, thank you. Okay, I'm gonna start off with a question. It's kind of a two-part question. First, like I'm gonna talk about like the overarching like structure of this novel because it's like episodic. It's like split up into like days. I was wondering how that came about. Like, was it planned originally? What was the process like for you, maybe, in like coming up with that?
Initially, the writing of the novel was sort of an adventure itself. I was just, just sort of following these characters. I was watching Marwan and his little band of cousins and uncles out on this road, and I was seeing what they were doing, and I was looking for places where they could go. I was looking for choices they could make, actions that would come to either lead to conflicts or would define them in different ways. But no, initially I hadn't started off with any sort of a set structure, and it sort of led to problems for me. I got to the point. It was actually right at this point where I'm reading the novel where I read that that I got kind of stuck in the novel. I wasn't sure where to go from that point forward, and it was also at that point that that I read the Arabian Nights for the first time. It had been on my shelf for years and years, and as I was reading the Arabian Nights, and as I was looking at the structure of that novel, the ways that you have the initial frame narrative, and then there's narratives within that narrative, and stories being told within each other, and it was at that point that that my vision of the structure of this novel sort of shifted a little bit, not only in terms of like the storytelling. So like instead of it being propelled necessarily by like the actions and choices of the characters, it became more so about seeking out which stories were going to continue to move the story forward. And so and so um, and it was also through the Arabian Nights that I, the other title for the Arabian Nights is 1001 Nights, but it was also through sort of that title and sort of thinking through how much time I wanted this novel to encompass. So in the beginning, I had actually sort of imagined the novel to be this very um, epic scope to the novel with like multiple generations and that sort of thing. But it was when I sort of condensed the time of the novel, and I sort of just I came upon that title, 99 Nights in Logar, and I was like, oh, it works. It works well as the title, but I also realized that it was going to work well as a structure for the novel as well. And so instead of having it be this, multi-generational sort of a project, I was like, I'm just going to keep it within these 3 months. That's all I was going to allow myself. And then in that way, it got sort of its episodic structure. It got, was able to use the storytelling to explore different timelines and time zones. Um, and that's where the sort of the structure came from.
All right, yeah. I mean that actually kind of partially answers my second question too, because I was going to ask you about all the storytelling that goes on in the novel, and like I guess, well, you answered a lot of it already, but I was also wondering maybe like I'm assuming maybe you had a lot of stuff that didn't make it into the novel, maybe like stories and stuff. Like maybe you could talk about that, like what you decided would fit maybe and what didn't, like how that kind of came about, or like maybe where some of the stuff came from also.
Yeah. Yeah, this project as a whole is really indebted to my entire family. It even feels weird just having my name by itself on the front of the cover, because it really was sort of a familial project. It really was, and even beyond that, sort of a communal project as well. A lot of the stories within the piece are based on stories that I grew up hearing from my parents and my grandparents, and so that's sort of like when going into this project, and once I realized that this was really a novel about storytelling itself, like this oral tradition of storytelling. I had this incredible wealth of stories to draw upon. And so it did sort of become like a good problem, in that did have to sort of figure out which stories could fit into the novel, which stories made sense thematically within the novel, which stories would further Marwan's understanding of himself and of his country and of this village and his family as a whole. And yeah, so really it was a lot of interviewing. I was going back and I was talking to my father a lot. I was talking to my mother about their childhood in Logar, and how they dealt with the situation of the war in Afghanistan, the Soviet occupation. I went back and I was speaking to my grandmother as well, and stories could fit, and then sort of having to decide that some of these other stories perhaps they'll go in a book in the future. But there was a point where I was like, okay, this is where I'm gonna have to sacrifice some stories. I'm gonna have to cut some stuff off, and just get this project done.
Right. I have one more question actually too, which kind of you brought up before. So you mentioned Arabian Nights and how that was like kind of a big influence for this novel. I was wondering maybe you could speak about, since this is about like storytelling, maybe more about like literary influence, how it's like influenced your work. Also, I mean, I guess you also mentioned like the storytelling of like your family too, that being like an influence too. Maybe you could speak more on that.
Yeah, quite a few. Let me actually have a few books here. I'm really indebted to this book here, 100 Years of Solitude, by Gabriela Garcia Marquez. That this was one of those books where when I first read it, I was so awestruck by what he was able to accomplish in just one novel in terms of, exploring the history of his country, of developing and building this fantastical village, of exploring the different generations of this incredible family, and being able, to give me all this insight into this, not only on like a personal familial level, but also in terms of like the political history and all this political turmoil. And there was so much, I think, reading 100 Years of Solitude, even more so than reading like other books written about Afghanistan. Um, for me, like Marquez's Colombia reflected my country back to me in ways that I hadn't anticipated, in ways that I hadn't read in any other book before. And so for me, it was like, it was being in awe and being like, I'll never be able to accomplish anything close to this. But also being sort of inspired by that, being inspired by the ways that like a political history could be enmeshed with a familial history, could be enmeshed with, all these, uh, with all these different human lives. And for me, it was like, after reading this book, my dream since then has been to, in one way or another, maybe write like a 100 years for Logar, or for Afghanistan as a whole. So that was a really big influence.
I'm going to take a question from the audience. Kaylin asks, thank you so much for reading. In the scene you read, a character tells a story. Can you talk a bit about how you write dialogue and how you manage to artfully include a story in dialogue?
I have so much trouble with dialogue, so I appreciate that comment a lot. I think I'm very much, I'm a big fan of Marquez. I'd also, in a certain way, I would consider myself a student of Marquez, and like Marquez, I think my writing can oftentimes be very summary heavy, and very event heavy, and very action heavy. And so, when I'm writing dialogue, oftentimes, sometimes I'll feel like straight up like, just like a thief, or plagiarist, in the ways that I'm drawing from my own experience, or the experiences of my family. But oftentimes, when I'm drawing dialogue, it's really based in the ways that like just me and my family members talk at home. And this really like fantastic magical thing will happen from time to time, where my family and I will be sitting around, the dastarkhan, eating dinner, we'll be drinking tea, or we'll be watching, Wheel of Fortune, or just something really mundane like that. And all of a sudden we'll be discussing something, and one thing will lead to another. And then, my mother or my father or my grandmother will be off on this, incredible story about, escaping, uh, escaping a bombing during the war, or just a moment from their childhood. This when when my father broke his arm and had to go travel by himself to another village to get it fixed, or so many other stories, just a wealth of stories. And so throughout my entire life, that's just how sort of our conversations had gone, especially I think our most memorable conversations. And I think that's really sort of, I think it really comes through in my writing, especially in my dialogue, where when I'm having characters speak to each other, I think it's always with sort of the inherent intention of both pushing those characters' relationships and trying to discover things about them, but also seeing like what stories they have to tell, and what conversations could lead to another story.
Paul asked, reminds me of putting a mosaic together. Did you run through a million permutations or sequences of maybe the stories themselves that you have in the novel, like different configurations?
Yeah, absolutely. That was sort of, it actually sort of became a bit of a structural problem for me, because some of the stories, some of the stories came about very naturally over the course of writing the novel. So, you know, one thing would lead to another, and my characters would be talking to each other, and then it would almost be as if I was just sitting in the room with them, and the story just sort of came out organically from the characters. But other stories, you know, I had actually written ahead of time, or there were stories that like I'd recorded from an interview with my father, and that I knew was going to go into the piece at a certain point. And so it was, you know, it was sort of this tricky process of configuring and reconfiguring, figuring out what information I should reveal at one point. You know, it was really interesting in the ways, and at the time, sort of um, almost like a frightening experience of like trying to figure out what the novel wanted from me in terms of structure, in terms of um, figuring out what to do next in the piece. It was really a process of discovery, I think.
Okay. I think that about wraps it up. Thank you. Thank you, everybody. Thank you, JAMIL. I'd like to encourage everybody to pick up a copy of 99 Nights in Logar. I got mine right here. And I'd like to thank the creators of WriterSpeak, as well as Frank, for helping run everything. And that concludes it. So thank you. Have a good night, everybody.
Night.